Greetings. My name is Sister Sabora Muhammad.
And I'm Sister Arifa Muhammad.
Today, we want to talk to you about two issues that affect our communities: food justice and food sovereignty. As you may know, there are many disparities plaguing our communities. Some of these disparities can be related to food justice and food sovereignty. This is why we must control our own foods. In order to control our own food, we must be educated about food and understand how we can take charge of our health. The Honorable Louis Farrakhan states in his book, Torchlight for America, knowledge is the principal resource that can help us take better care of our bodies and our health. And I know we're all very interested in taking very good care of our bodies and our health. According to the Institute of Agriculture, Trade, and Policy, food justice is the right of communities everywhere to produce, process, distribute, access, and eat good food, regardless of race, class, gender, ethnicity, citizenship, ability, religion, or community. Hence, as stated in the Muslim program, point number 2 of what the Muslims want, we want justice, equal justice under the law. We want justice applied equally to all, regardless of creed, class, or color. As we know, we control very little in regards to our production, distribution, and access to eat good, wholesome food. We deserve to distribute, have access to, and to produce food. Having the proper food should be a right. And Sister Arthur will elaborate a little bit more on food sovereignty.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. So, food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is the right of people to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agricultural systems. It puts the aspirations and needs of those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of food systems and policy rather than the demands of markets and corporations. Often we are provided particular food by zip code. According to the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad, no people can be free with their mouth in the kitchen of another, particularly in the kitchen of our former slave masters and their children. Food sovereignty is the right to choose what food to eat, where it comes from, and how it is grown. So we will elaborate this more as we go through our presentation on food justice and sovereignty, specifically in the African American community and peoples of color.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And that's interesting that I was listening to the definition and the information you had in regards to zip code, because we know that sometime in our communities, there is not the best food. As we know that there are food deserts. So a lot of times our communities receive the worst food. So let's talk a little bit on food security versus food sovereignty and what's the difference. So food security does not distinguish where food comes from or the conditions under which it is produced and distributed. National food security targets are often met by sourcing food produced under environmentally destructive and exploitative conditions and supported by subsidies and policies that destroy local food producers but benefit agribusiness corporation. So the local producers don't necessarily get the benefit because you have the larger corporations that produce benefit. And food sovereignty emphasizes the ecologically appropriate production, distribution, and consumption, social economic justice, and local food systems as ways to tackle hunger and poverty and guarantee sustainable food security for all peoples. It advocates trade and investment that serve the collective aspirations of society. Why food justice? You may be asking. Well, land and food have been weaponized throughout the history of the US. The food system as we know it was built in large part by controlling people of color through force and, of course, coercion, including the Native American, enslaved Africans, Chinese, and Mexican farm workers, and many more. Low-income white farmers have also struggled in very real ways, but historically and currently, but they have not been discriminated against on account of their race. Since historical racially motivated policies and beliefs created the current system, any discussion about changing it must also include a frank, very frank discussion about the long-term consequences of those policies, as well as how race motivates policies and culture today. The hard truth about food and agriculture in the US begins with the fact that the vast majority of this nation's farms are on stolen land. Federal laws, including the 1830 Indian Removal Act, which mandated that tens of thousands of people be removed from the land they had inhabited for countless generations. The US Army supported efforts to exterminate, and I again repeat, to exterminate the buffalo, which was a primary food source for tribes of the Great Plains, as a strategy to starve Native Americans into submission. The taken land was then redistributed for free or at extremely low cost to settlers, most of whom were white, through measures such as the Homestead Act. Business in both the North and South were enriched for more than a century by legal slavery. Following the Civil War, the passage of sweeping Jim Crow laws institutionalized discrimination and ensured that cruel and unequal treatment of African Americans would continue for decades. As a result, many former slaves and the descendants continued working in the fields, well, sharecropping, or to pay off debts, often in conditions not notably better than enslavement. Those who were able to buy land often didn't have it for long. Black farmland ownership today is at about 6% of what it was at its peak in the 1920s. Black farmers were dispossessed by discriminatory practices by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and by acts of racial intimidation and terror. Many rural Black Southerners were fleeing violence when they moved to the northern states as part of the Great Migration. History has repercussions. Those low rates of Black property ownerships, they are key causes of today's massive wealth gap. And we know that we have a very large wealth gap.
So I'm going to go ahead and go into the background and the national landscape in regarding, specifically speaking about food security. So we want to talk about why in the African American community we are feeling food insecurities. And just to go through some statistics to give us a better picture of what's happening today. So as we talk about food insecurities, approximately 14.5% of U.S. households experience some form of food insecurity. People of color, of course, are significantly more likely than their white counterparts to experience food insecurity. And we're going to talk about some of those, why this is happening. So some of the definitions we want to discuss. Food insecurity, of course, is the limited, uncertain availability of nutritionally adequate and safe foods. Acute food insecurity refers to having an unstable source of food. So you might eat today, but not necessarily knowing where your next is coming from. And then, of course, hunger. So we know hunger being an uneasy or painful sensation caused by lack of food. And we know hunger is potentially, but not necessarily, a consequence of food insecurity. As you'll see, you may not necessarily be hungry, but you're not necessarily eating the best foods either. So this first graph talks about disparities in food insecurity. So as you can see in this graph on the left, we have the African American community, the Hispanic community, almost twice or more than twice that of the white community experience food insecurity. So this is almost twice that of the national average, which is 14%. So we're looking at a huge disparity in food insecurity, strictly just looking at race and ethnicity. One of the problems with this food insecurity is food access. So in many ways, the food system, it promotes the oppression of minority groups through a variety of barriers, including a lack of land ownership, we've talked about, and lending practices for minority farmers, poor working conditions and wage discrimination for minority farmers, and lack of access to healthy food in neighborhoods of color. There's structural racism, that's seen in our food system through housing discrimination, employment, and redlining. And it's also important to note because these practices affect opportunities for minorities to have access to healthy foods that will reduce the prevalence of adverse health conditions in our communities.
Mm.
So this talks about food access, so the availability of food store outlets by store type and income. And as you can see, the three levels of income. So we have the low income, middle income, and high income. So as we look across from left to right, we're looking at chain supermarkets, non-chain supermarkets, grocery stores, convenience stores. And as you can see, for the most part, those in the high income, they have more of the chain supermarkets. They really have more of everything. They have more grocery stores, more chain supermarkets, but they have less convenience stores. So they
Mhm.
have less liquor stores in every corner, less of those mom and pop type shops that don't necessarily have the best foods. But you find that prevalent in the low income communities.
And also to add, Sister Arfa, we can bear witness to the reality because in a lot of our communities, there are food deserts. There are not grocery stores. Our people cannot go and get good food from grocery stores because they're not available in there.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And, there's a saying, zip codes, it makes a difference.
Absolutely. Being in the Bay Area, and frequently being in Oakland, California, we can absolutely see when we look at East Oakland and West Oakland, there's absolutely a food desert. There are no grocery stores in East Oakland other than those mom and pop shops, and they don't necessarily have the best food. And the people, they're not black owned for the most part, so they're not really caring what they're giving to our community. It's grossly overpriced. And
Mm-hmm.
because in those communities, people do not necessarily have transportation to go to some other parts of town or other cities to get what they need, they have no choice.
Mm. Right. I agree.
So, some socioeconomic factors of food insecurity. So, these are some indicators on that this graph talks about the national average as compared to high food insecurity rates in US counties. So, there are many socioeconomic factors that can negatively impact food security. So, income inequality is often the main cause for many health disparities and affordability of healthy foods in low income communities. So you can look at these here and you'll see on the national average, we're looking at poverty rates, unemployment rates, and food insecurity rates. So if we look at poverty rates on a national average, unemployment rate, and food insecurity rates, you'll see the disparity. So for those high with the high unemployment, it coincides with high food insecurity rates. If you look at the poverty levels, it coincides with high food insecurity rates. So they go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
And something we want to also make sure we talk about is housing discrimination and food access. So we know it's definitely worth noting that the housing market discrimination prevented minorities from moving to locations where access to healthy food was available. Until the Fair Housing Act of 1968, housing and lending market discrimination was considered legal. Now, since then, illegal housing and lending market discrimination has persisted, of course, causing disparities in the availability of supermarkets in low income and minority neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you can see, like we see in Oakland, that gentrification, where those
Right.
housing costs increase to the point where those who may have lived in the area for many, many years can no longer afford the housing in that area. So
Mm-hmm.
now we're forced to leave those areas And of course, they're going to build them up for themselves. So while we're there, they're not going to have that accessibility and food resources and those grocery stores. So you're not going to have the Whole Food markets and the Trader Joe's, right? You're going to have that liquor store on the corner. You're going to have that Jack in the Box, that McDonald's, right? But as gentrification moves in, of course, all that's going to move out. Now you're going to see the Whole Foods. Now you're going to see the Trader Joe's. Now you're going to see those specialty food store types that you see in some of those affluent neighborhoods.
Right. And that's why, food justice is an imperative. And there really are many models out there to follow that we can get into later. But a lot of times we're not thinking about when we're seeing all these new apartment complexes and all these other buildings being built. We're not thinking that where are our grocery stores when we need these things in our community, but those things were not prevalent in those communities.
Absolutely. So how does food insecurity impact our health? So we know, since we don't have access to the most healthiest of foods, and we're forced to eat, less than optimal items,
Mhm.
specifically fast foods, we know it's going to create unhealthy diets. So this amplifies the negative outcomes experienced by food insecure individuals. So the combination of unhealthy diet and food insecurity leads has health implications as well as financial implications. So of course, some of the main topics is the impaired growth in our children, and then the more chronic diseases for adults. So we know in our communities, we're suffering from those chronic conditions, those diabetes, that obesity, those high blood pressure, which also has financial implications because now if you can get health care, your health care cost is going to be much higher.
Mhm.
And for those who are working, that's going to count for missed work days and lower income. It all has an impact.
That's true. That's true.
So this talks about the food insecurity and impact on health. This is specifically speaking about obesity rates. So on the graph on the left, the gray graph talks about children ages 2 to 19 by race and the prevalence of obesity. And as you can see, the African American and the Hispanic community lead the way in obesity rates for our children as opposed to our Caucasian counterparts. And the same thing for the obesity rates for those 20 and over. I mean, it is significantly higher in the African American community and Hispanic community compared to the Caucasian community. And this should really be an alarm. This should really be something really studied further and much more being done to address these issues, because this obesity leads to so many other health problems, and this is something that absolutely needs to be addressed.
Mhm. It's true.
So just in conclusion on this aspect, we know that food insecurity and lack of access to healthy food affects the health and well-being of vulnerable and low-income African Americans. So it's not solely the problem for local incomes, but it's a concern for everyone. It's a concern across our nation. Food insecurity and lack of access to healthy foods affects every part of our society, including education, healthcare, national security, our state and local national economies. As one of the richest countries in the world, we must address this basic necessity of life. There's no person here should go without food. And as a community, we must push for action and work towards strengthening our food systems and making them more equitable for all. And I just added this
Right.
little information here at the bottom when it talks about our children and being in insecure households. Nearly
Mhm.
1 in 3 African American children live in insecure food households, as opposed to 1 in 6 Caucasian children.
Mhm.
That's an alarming statistic, and
That's
something we
right.
have to really look more closely at and how we can change that.
Right. Mm. It's true. So, what is the goal? So, food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient. And I think about this word sufficient because sometimes we can have food and different things, but is it sufficient? And that's a question that we have to ask. safe and nutritious? Is it nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life? Because someone can give us food, but it may not be the best food. They may try to tell us, well, you can go and get some food down here, get this food box here, or go to a fast food. Is it what our children need? Is it what our families need? And it's something that we have to ask the question. We have to control our own food. Food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is the right of people to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. And we as a people have to think about sovereignty. We have to take ownership of growing, processing, and distributing our own food for our own families. Food sovereignty. Well, 6 principles of food sovereignty call for the focus on food for people, valuing food providers, respecting our farmers, supporting the farmers, the co-ops, those who are producers, valuing food providers, localizing food systems. It's important to support our local farmers, making decisions locally, building knowledge and skills, working with nature. So a lot of times we may be thinking, well, how can I have my own garden or community co-op a garden? Because I don't have land. Well, we have to start where right where we are. You can look outside your homes and see if there's a grow box or something that you can develop. There may be, you may grow carrots and someone else may grow potatoes. So you can start with a barter system and supporting those who do have the systems already in place.
Absolutely.
What can we do? Well, first we can study the issues and get a better understanding. This legacy of food insecurity continues today, with many groups working to claim the rightful place of indigenous people and people of color in the narrative of the U.S. food system and fight for both racial justice and access to good, healthy food for all. Your health is your wealth. We have to think about our health. And something else I was thinking of, we're taught in the Nation of Islam, in the book of How to Eat to Live, is we should eat 1 meal a day, and we should eat the navy bean, which is a very, very nutritional being. And it's something that can help our people today. It has helped us in the past, but we can do many things with it. So you don't have to have a lot of money to be an agent of change. You can be empowered to be an agent of change. For many African American led farm and food organization, and empowerment begins by reckoning with the trauma of slavery, working with their populations to redefine a relationship with land from one of trauma and violence to one of healing and power. So we can start again growing our food and collaborating with those who do have co-ops and local farms to control our food.
Absolutely. And I think this, just mentioning this here by being empowered and not, reckoning with the trauma of slavery. So we know there is an aspect of our community that we don't want to have anything to do with agriculture. We don't want to have anything to do with working the land when that is the most vital area that we can really work in. We are really focused on, what other industries can I get into? Can I get into the tech, law, medicine? Not realizing that all of those people have to eat.
Right. Everyone needs food.
Everyone needs food.
That's right.
We have to really reckon with that trauma of that slavery and not wanting to have anything to do with that land and developing that land and working that land, not realizing that's probably one of the most important areas we can really work in.
Right. And we have to stop thinking that it's something below us.
Right.
To be able to learn agribusiness or agriculture, to get into those fields. because we want to feed our families and help eventually feed the nation. So again, we want to be agents of change and find out how can we become agents of change. So what can we do? Well, there's different organizations that we can support. We have the African American Food Justice Organizations, Soul Fire Farm, Freedom Food Alliance, the Detroit Black Community Food Security, Black Urban Growers, National Black Food and Justice Alliance, Federation of Southern Cooperatives, Southeastern African American Farmers Organic Network. So those are organizations that you can contact and you can ask, how can I help? How can I be of assistance?
Absolutely. And there's many more. We just have to take the time to really research them out in our own community.
That's right.
And so, what can you do? So, as Sister Sabor had mentioned, look for those co-ops, support your local farmers markets, support that small farmer, that small business who's trying to bring fresh produce and fresh food items into the community. And, we want to look at, supporting food justice organizations led by people of color. You know, Soul Fire Farms has a reparations map that shows food and farm projects, across the country. Let's do some research and look into that. Support our local supermarkets that are Black owned. And encourage them to be part of these organizations like the Domestic Fair Trade Association and things like that help promote and uphold standards of fair treatment of farm workers, as well as promoting, social justice issues. And really look and study the history of race and food systems. Let's look at some of these books I did mention here in our last point here, the different books that we can look at, but we want to make sure that we are really taking time and understanding and studying these things so we can be part of the solution, be agents of change.
Right, right. And we want to make sure that we don't think that because we're students or, we're busy that we can't participate and we can't even think about the health of ourselves, the health of our families, and the health of our nation, because it's important to be healthy, especially now. But you have to think about, take another look on what exactly is food sovereignty, what exactly is food justice. And as I mentioned early, we should have justice. We should have justice, and we should be able to control our food sources.
Absolutely. And as Sister Deborah said, part of that is just it starts with us doing the small things,
Mm-hmm.
the small things by supporting our, like we said, local farmers markets. Let's support, our local Black grocer if we're fortunate enough to be in a city that has one.
Right.
Because those Whole Foods and those Trader Joe's, they're gonna make their money.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to make their money, and not necessarily, and then, they're not bad because they do have better food sources than some of these grocery stores that we come across, better than Safeway. But we have to look at, what we can do on an individual basis, start there at least, and then look at how we can do this as a whole, as a community. But some of this is, as we looked at some of the statistics, they're really, it's really surprising when you look at it, what the disparity is between our community and the Caucasian community.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really up to us, we have to look out for us.
Right. And again, ask yourself, how can I be a part? For yourself, it can be something as simple as starting your own garden, starting in your backyard, or doing a grow box, or doing something inside. But there are many different ways that you can help be a part of the solution. And don't feel like, again, because you're a student, that you cannot be a part of the solution. You can. And remember, knowledge empowers us. So we want to make sure that we have an understanding on exactly the importance of food sovereignty and food justice, because it's really important, especially in our community. And earlier we spoke about food in different zip codes. We know that sometime in our particular neighborhoods, there may not be the best quality of food. And get in the habit of the food that you do have, the fruits and vegetables. Learn how to pick the proper food. Learn how to pick your vegetables. Learn how to look and read the labels, and making sure that the food that you put in this temple is the best food. Okay?
Yes, yes. And we know for a lot of our students, it's difficult to get away from that fast food, but that
Exactly.
is absolute death. And you have to
Yes.
know it's absolute death. And you really want to try your best to steer clear of that fast food.
Right. And learn how to cook for yourself. Um, Brothers and sisters, I mentioned early the navy bean, which is a staple in the diet of the Muslims, but it's something that helps to keep us very, very healthy. And it's something that's very inexpensive. The navy bean soup. There's so many different things that you can do with the navy beans. We can do bean burgers or bean pies, which I'm sure you all have heard of. But learn how to take care of yourself. Learn how to cook for yourself. Learn how to meal plan for yourself. Learn how to shop for yourself, so you can put the best of foods inside of your bodies. No need in getting your degree, learning all of the information, but you have not learned how to take care of yourself, because self-preservation is the first law.
That's right. And that's important because as we talked about the health disparities, when we don't take care of ourselves, meaning eating the right foods from the beginning, that
That's
will
right.
translate into economic hardships. Those healthcare costs, they're only increasing. You don't want to be, getting to that older age, because right now you're young, and of course you're invincible, right? But
Right.
you get into that point when you want to reach those 40s and 50s, but you don't want to have high blood pressure. You
Right.
don't want to be obese. You
Right.
definitely do not want to have diabetes. And
Right.
all what you do now will affect you later. So
Right.
those are things that we really need to think about when we think about food security and food sovereignty.
Right. And you want to think about getting the best, the vitamins that you need for your body from whole foods. You don't want to have to take synthetic vitamins. You want to be able to get what you need from your foods, just like vitamin D. You want to be able to get that from the sun. And we mentioned earlier about nature and the importance of nature. Well, you are going to have a relationship with your garden when you
Mhm.
become a gardener, because you have to prep your soil, and you'll have to water your plants and take care of your plants. But it's beautiful to be able to see this is something that you have produced with your hands, and you know that it's organic because you produced it. We don't necessarily know that the things that are organic for sure, for sure. We're told that they're organic, but if you're able to grow your own foods, then you can say, well, I know what I put into these proper things, these foods, and I know that there were any type of pesticides that I put in here. So you all have to look again, self-preservation is the first law, and you have to start taking care of this temple here, meaning good food research, food prep, cooking your food, taking care of yourself, and eating the proper foods. And as Sister Arfa says, stay away from those fast food restaurants. I know it's easy to go to, but you'll find more joy in cooking your food and growing your food than harvesting and cooking your food.
That's right.
Okay.
All right. Thank you all for listening. We will be available, Sabora, keep me honest on this, on Instagram Live for questions. And that
January
is
the 28th.
January. And
Okay.
we look forward to hearing from you all then.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.